Good afternoon, and welcome to today's webinar hosted by the Colorado chapter of HFMA. The topic for today's webinar is clinical trial compliance and reimbursement, avoiding the traps. I'd like to welcome today's guest presenter, Denise Hall-Garland. With more than 3 decades experience in the healthcare industry, Denise serves as a principal with the firm's hospital and physician compliance advisory service team. She provides business advisory services for a variety of organizations, including hospitals, health systems, physicians, and behavioral health and post-acute care organizations. She has extensive experience in compliance-related matters, including oversight of numerous independent review organizations. She has also conducted and managed more than 500 physician coding and documentation seminars. At this time, I will give the floor to today's guest presenter, Denise. Please go ahead.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for spending your time with us, and hopefully you'll find some pearls of wisdom in this presentation. Those of you that are in clinical trial practice in your organizations, you know that it can be very comprehensively complex and confusing. So our job today is to try to share some pearls of wisdom from all those years she just described in dealing with clinical trials. So we'll go ahead and get started. Let's talk first about our objectives for the day. So whether you are in the practice of clinical trials or you're thinking about starting a clinical trial service offering, there are some key specific considerations that must be addressed prior to even beginning that. And if you are already doing clinical trials, then these are the things that need to be considered as you go into new protocols. Then we'll talk about the regulatory framework around this, which is also very complex, confusing, and lots of acronyms. We'll discuss some of the operational and compliance challenges, and then give you a flavor for some of the governmental investigations that have been through 2005 to forward. That'll give you a flavor for what the acronyms I mentioned that carry guns like the FBI and the OIG actually are interested in. So let's talk about the key considerations as you go into a clinical trials. There are 4 main aspects that need to be very seriously considered. The first is the legal aspects of your contractual arrangements, and this is often overlooked in organizations, especially if you are the ones that are managing the business of clinical trials and you have little legal support from your general counsel or internal compliance or external compliance and legal assistance. These are contracts, and they need to be addressed as contracts, and there needs to be a clear understanding of what those contracts look like, and we'll talk about that more in just a minute. Budgeting, how you're going to budget for the protocols, and then how you're going to administer that budget as you go through the billing of the services and supplies and drugs that are used. Your protocol requirements. In the middle of all this is our patients. So having a clear understanding of what the protocol is, what the requirements are, how they're going to be monitored, how they're going to be reported, how you're going to report adverse events, etc., really needs to be a key critical component. And honestly, this is probably where most of my organizations do the best, which is good because we do have the patient in mind. However, there are some issues that arise with that, and we'll discuss that in just a bit. And lastly, the regulatory framework. Lots and lots of people are looking at this. We're going to look at those in a little bit of detail and talk about what that actually means. But first, let's talk about the life cycle of a clinical trial. Much like the revenue cycle, clinical trials have a significant life cycle that is very complicated. And usually this starts with a sponsor or a investigator saying, hey, I've got a great idea and we'd like to see if this can do some good. That's the starting point. Then the development of your protocols, as I discussed earlier, with your protocol development being one of those that is critical to the administration of the clinical trial and reporting of the results. The negotiating of the budget and contracts. This is where I mentioned earlier that you need to have a legal face on this. that it does not need to mean that you should have a paralegal that sits in your clinical research program reviewing contracts. You actually need an attorney who understands contractual language that can protect your organization from unnecessary risk. And when I say unnecessary risk, I'm not just talking about an unnecessary risk as it relates to compliance, but I'm talking about this unnecessary financial risk. Running through then, we go into our IRB, or Investigative Review Board approval, and then enrolling our subjects via informed consent. Informed consent gets a lot of discussion and should be viewed very seriously. We want to make sure that our subjects understand the risk of the particular protocol or investigation, as well as the potential benefits of those, and that they are enrolling with you voluntarily and not through coercion or ugly reimbursement or payback for lunches or any of that kind of stuff. And so that's a very critical piece. Now I'm going to talk about the common rule here in just a moment, and there's an update to the common rule that really does impact this informed consent matter. So we get to the middle of this program and we actually get to provide clinical services. This is where we probably do the best. We have our PIs, we have our clinicians, we have our team pulled together that's going to administer whatever protocol that you've developed and monitor and report on that. The good news is this is the best area. There are some pitfalls that occur that we'll talk about here shortly that are related to behavior patterns and just bad performers. But at the core, this really is something that seems to happen very well in most cases. And then we get into the complex area of how do we bill for these services. And we're going to spend a lot of time talking about that, so I'm not going to go into detail about that now. And lastly, what do we do if we don't use all the funds? And who needs to be involved in that? Is this held in finance? Do you have a special department that takes care of that? How is that actually being taken care of? So we've talked about the revenue cycle of a clinical trial. Well, here we are. We've got it planned. We've done everything. We've gone through that whole process and we're getting ready to start. We've got our protocol in place. We've identified our patient population and we're ready to roll. Everybody's excited about what might happen. And then, oh, by the way, something happens. Then we have to make sure that we are abiding by every acronym over the sun in this instance: General Data Protection Regulations, good laboratory practice regulations that's governed by the FDA, and then the common rule. Now, I want to spend just a moment on the common rule, and then we'll go on to our others. But under HIPAA, you all know that the conditions established related to PHI came through our HIPAA. The privacy rule defines the means by which individuals will be informed of uses or disclosures of medical information for research purposes and their right to access information. The Federal Policy for Protection of Human Subjects was actually published in 1991, and it was adopted in separate regulations by over 15 federal departments, which, as we cloud up the sun, you'll understand that they have some impact in the federal policy. Within that particular policy, the common rule was revised in 2017. It's been amended twice to give us guidance on what we must do to comply with this new version. In June of 2018, the government published the final rule for the common rule. It was implemented as of January 21st, 2019. The big thing I mentioned about this whole issue is about the privacy management and how you might go about gaining your informed consent. It establishes new requirements for assuring compliance by research institutions and requirements for researchers obtaining informed consents. And it also talks about the requirements for the Institutional Review Board, about how they should operate reviews, and essentially it's adopting a more formalized compliance plan. But related to the informed consent, there's a whole new key element section, and it allows for the rearrangement of content to facilitate a subject's decision to participate or not. In fact, what the purpose of this potential rule is, or this final rule, is that the informed consent is really supposed to be in layman's terms to allow for a layperson to understand clearly what the benefits are of the clinical trial, what the risks are, and to ensure that they agree with the fact that they are going to be involved in the clinical trial, which is really critically important for our patient populations. But also, it allows the definition of certain types of programs to be limited or to be necessary for more detailed review. So this went into place in January of 2019. And so it is, if you are administering clinical trials and you have active trials, it would be good to go back and look at the definitions of limited versus full trial, because they have, the whole attempt at this is to ease the burden on us of the documentation and the annual reviews that must occur. In fact, with the annual review process, it allows for no annual review for certain categories of research if they go beyond a year. So certainly something to pay attention to. So on with our acronyms. We have, of course, the Food and Drug Administration. We have a HIPAA, which we've already talked about. We have the Sunshine Act that we're going to discuss in more detail in just a moment, and the impact on why that matters. Conflicts of interest, I'll talk about that a bit later when we start dealing with our PI conversations. The Affordable Care Act, the Good Clinical Practice Act. We have the CFR 50, which talks about promoting objectivity in research that must be reviewed. Then we have our Medicare program that overlays a whole different level of things that must be done as standard to the clinical trials guidance. We have numerous oversight agencies that we're going to talk about in just a moment. We have, again, the FDA, we have CMS, we have the OIG, it goes on and on and on and on forever. So you can see it becomes very, very, very muddy and very complicated. And we'll talk in a moment about why there are so many fingers in this pie and so many things are being reviewed and addressed by so many different agencies. Because then it begins to feel like it's going to rain. So who has oversight? All of these organizations have some finger in this, and all of them can take regulatory action if there's a suspicion that there's been ill behavior and there's been a poor quality of performance, and if they happen to get a notification by someone who might be a key TAM relator, which is occurring more and more often. So it's important to understand that this is not an easy task. It's not easy to ensure that you are addressing all the different elements that these organizations might actually be interested in. So let's talk about the Sunshine Act and why it matters with this conversation. With the Sunshine Act in place, there is reporting that is occurring now that's been going on since about 2015 related to open payments data. Now, open payments data by CMS reporting is everything, but they do actually break out research dollars that are spent by the government in research studies and royalties. And as of 2017 reporting period, or actually, excuse me, this is actually as of 2015 through 2017 reporting period, the report stated that manufacturers have spent over $4 billion on research payments and associated funds. Now, the second piece of this is really where it becomes very, very interesting. This includes payments to teaching hospitals, which are often governed by the attending physicians, and payments are listed under a specific physician's name. CMS noted that this total includes payments for the company making the payment was named as a physician as the primary recipient, and payments to a research institute or entity where the physician is named as a principal investigator on a research project. Now, why do we care? For those of you that are in healthcare, you understand there is a lot of focus on anti-kickback, antitrust, and conflict of interest, as well as compensation arrangements and incentivizing physicians to utilize resources. So obviously with a big number like $4 billion, it's raised a lot of attention and has really publicized where the dollars might be. So in this slide, this is open payments in 2017, which will be federal fiscal year 2017, which is 2016 actually. If you look at the second two lines on each section, total volume, dollar value of reported payments for research payments, $4.6 billion, and the total number of research payment records is over 600,000. Now, interesting thing about this data, you'll see that there's been a little bit of a decline in the number of payment records, while the dollar figure has remained flat. The payment records may be consolidation of EHRs. There's not really anything in this report that determines why this looks a little bit different. Well, you're saying, okay, so all these open payments and the payments by companies, where does it sit? Well, in the 2017 report, you can see from this slide that it's kind of scattered, but Pfizer has definitely led the charge for this particular period. Novartis was above that in the prior period, but there has been some significant changes in leadership. So just interesting to get a feel for kind of where we are with this. And then where are the payments by states? For you being in Colorado, it was kind of interesting for me to take a look at this. You'll see that the payments have really changed, and from the 2016, with Maryland having a 25% increase in research payments, at the same time that Michigan actually fell off as a leader. They had a 28% decrease in research payments. As far as where Colorado would sit on this, in the report only detailed down to about the top 25 in research payments, and Colorado was not on that list. So we've got this wonderful clinical trial, but there's lots and lots of pressures all around. Our facility's goal should be to provide safe, effective care, to bill correctly, and receive fair compensation. This is made very, very difficult, and there's a lot of people that have their fingers in it. Considerations of the sponsor, the investigator, the site, where you're going to be doing this, who the patient is, and how it all engages with the overall clinical trial. So when you get to the coverage matters, there's really three indicators that drive this. From a Medicare standpoint, it's CMS's regulatory guidance. It's all the information that they provide as far as their standards of care, what they look at, and how all that is governed. With the Affordable Care Act, the Affordable Care Act has actually come through and addressed other payers and has provided guidance for other payers of how they should treat clinical trials and how they should pay for clinical trials. And as always, there's a difference. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. But lastly, you have your state legislation. And as any of us that work kind of at a national level know, there's not one state that's the same as the other. So it's very important that you consider all three of these indicators as you're looking at the trial that you're about to engage in, whether it is going to have to follow this more stringent CMS regulatory guidelines, or you have more flexibility with the Affordable Care Act guidelines, and what is your state legislation state that must be done related to the use of clinical trials. So let's talk about CMS for a little bit. So there's a National Coverage Determination 310.1, Medicare's clinical trial policy. It was developed in the early 60s because of the drug industry and the spark of new investigational drugs and investigational drugs designations. Medicare established a reputation for covering only the bare essentials, Really, if you look at the stringency of it, you'll see that all they said that they would cover are everything that's not paid for within the clinical trial. And back when we first started reviewing clinical trials, for the most part, that was negligible. There was really nothing that was outside of that clinical trial. I think the definition has expanded a little bit based in the past few years, where there's a little bit more opportunity to define routine and what is part of the coverage and what is not. This NCD actually summarizes what may or may not be covered for patients. It's broken down into 3 steps. It must be evaluated and determined if it qualifies, and that's why you see qualifying trial. And then there has to be a determination of the routineness of services. And this must be actually tested through the qualifying trial period here, as well as looking at what is routine too. So from a qualifying trial standpoint, there's about 7 different things to consider. 4 of them, all you need is 1. Is it funded by certain entities, such as the National Institutes for Health, or the CDC, or CMS, or the Department of Department of Defense? Is it supported by anybody that works with them? Does it have a investigational new drug number that states it's going to be reviewed by the FDA, or is the trial actually exempt from having that number? There you go. It's not necessarily that type of trial. Now, if you move on to qualifying criteria, all 3 of the below on this slide must be a yes. It must be in the purpose of evaluating a Medicare benefit. So, for example, is what we're doing actually going to benefit our patients? Does it have a therapeutic intent? And finally, it must include diagnosed beneficiaries. So this NCD defines routine costs of qualifying trials as items and services generally provided absent clinical trial. So it's not a part of the clinical trial. Items and services required solely for the administration of the service. And then items needed for reasonable and necessary care arising from the provision of investigational services. It excludes investigational items or services unless they're covered outside the trial. Things that are done solely for data collection. They don't use direct clinical management, or stuff that's provided by the sponsor for free to any enrollee. And then you get into that whole thing of what can we actually do for the enrollee. Here's the kicker. We had Medicare as one of our clouds. Every rule that we managed to for all of our Medicare patients applies here. Got to cover medical necessity. It's got to be deemed reasonably necessary. It has to meet conditions of participation. So all those things must be considered as you're going through this process. Also, in 2007, there were modifiers that were adopted that went into effect in 2008 to further define on outpatient claims if we believed that this clinical service or item was part of the study or it's not part of the study. And then it goes on to state that if you happen to have enrolled a particular clinical trial in a clinicaltrials.gov, that we'd like for you to also add a designated 8-digit clinical trial number. As of today, as far as we understand, the clinical trial number is voluntary. There's not been an update on this that would tell you that you have to use it, but then they've asked for a tracking number if you did use it. This is sort of like our registries and things like that. There is detailed guidance for the use of these modifiers that is located in Medicare Publication 100-3, Section 310.01. And to give you an example of what the use of this modifier would look like or describe to you that, we have a patient that has arthritis, is in arthritis research. study where the sponsor would pay for a CBC and a metabolic panel every month. So in those instances, they also had a dilantin level done, and they happened to have they must have fallen because they happened to have their elbow and their ankle x-rayed, as well as they had a patient visit. All of those last things would be necessary to designate with a routine Q1 modifier on the HCPCS code, and then the other two could be reported with the Q0, and that would take care of that for you. So now let's move on to what the Affordable Care Act does for us. It really addresses other payer obligations. So if you have clinical trials in which your patients are participating that they happen to not be in the Medicare program, which could be a lot, it's important to understand what these definitions say. It says that we must cover routine patient costs for qualifying individuals for approved clinical trials. There's a lot of definitions as opposed to a description of what that looks like, who a qualified individual might be, and then the routine cost definition, typically provided absent clinical trial. You can't impose other additional requirements on the patient, such as they've got to take responsibility for it, and they're provided by the network provider. So actually the difference between the Affordable Care Act and CMS is there's at this point, a little less stringency on the definitions of routine costs, routine care, and usual patient costs, as opposed to the hoops to be jumped through for the CMS approval for clinical trials and qualifying trials. We actually have a report that was done by MD Anderson that says when you manage to the ACA mandate, it does help with approval. There's a shorter turnaround time, and there's a little bit more approval rate for the studies to be implemented, which is a good thing for all of us. But as any payers do, they're often looking for ways to address potential overpayment for services rendered. So in this particular example, United Healthcare actually went forward and developed their own coverage determinations that went into effect February of this year that is much more in line with Medicare. So it's important to understand that if you do administer these programs with other commercial or other payers, that you verify what kind of coverage they'll be related to the service that you're about to provide. Regarding state law, most states have laws that pretty much require plans to cover routine costs of clinical trials. They're supposed to cover costs of experimental procedures, et cetera. But state law is not preempted by the Affordable Care Act. So again, I go back to understand what you're dealing with. So if you've got Medicare population that's in your clinical trial, understand your state coverage and your CMS coverage. If you've got commercial patients that are through your clinical trials, understand the same. This table is really just in an effort to show the differences between the different coverages. With Medicare's, of course, government funded, therapeutic intent, Affordable Care Act, life-threatening disease, and then a hybrid of the two as you move out into other payer sources. We go flip down to the bottom, it says special coding. Of course, Medicare, we already talked about the modifiers, but no different than any other commercial payer that we deal with every day. The payer is going to determine what kind of coding is needed to process a claim if there's anything that's necessary. From a billing perspective, you kind of see the three different buckets that these could fall into. Bucket A, it could be an industry sponsor, a grant. There could be no clinical services that are billed to the research subject or her insurer, so his or her insurer, so it's fairly clean. Study B, these services are typically billed to the research subject or insurer, but can be paid by the sponsor if agreed upon, and that's where the legal contractual arrangements become very important in the language there. A sponsor must agree to pay for those specific standards of care for all study patients. It's not allowed for them to pick and choose, and it's not allowed for a sponsor to agree to pay only when insurance does not. So it's kind of a mesh of stuff there. We go on to a mixed service. Some of the studies related to clinical services are standard of care and paid by insurance or the research subject, and some are performed for research purposes only and paid for by the study. So those are typical buckets. I'd really say that probably a bucket B is the one that we see most commonly. So risk areas, well, they're all over the place. Just to reel off a few. Things that we see most often as issues. First and foremost is the risk of double billing. As you start to define what's a routine cost, it can become very, very muddy. And as your organizations consider how are we going to treat these services or supplies or drugs, some of our clients have landed toward the conservative route, and they pull apart and they do not bill for much of anything. Others take a little bit more aggressive stroke and say, okay, yes, we understand this is part of the routine care outside the clinical trial, and we're going to go ahead and bill for those things, which in my opinion you should, but you need to make sure it's not doubled up on the sponsor side. Perfect example of this would be one of my clients told me that they didn't want to bill for anything to any patients and or their insurers, because that's what they do. They're grant funded. They're heavily funded by donors and things like that. It's not their mission. Their mission is to save people, which my response to that is if you bill and collect for the things that you can legitimately collect for, you have lots more opportunity to serve other patients. So a lot of it has to do with the risk to the organization, but it's certainly an area that needs to be addressed. Protocol deviation. And I'm gonna ball this with academic misconduct. Those two, excuse me, those two kind of go hand in hand, in which there is an opportunity as the PI or even the fellow that might be working on these protocols decides to take a little shortcut or leniency or change or a little bit of embellishment on actual documentation of patient outcomes. That we move into a space which can be very scary and scary for the organization, scary for the patient, and can create some unnecessary quality risk-related matters on behalf of the organization and also of the patient. Informed consent is another one. We talked about the new common rule language, which allows you to be a little bit more clear in your language. I was with a client, they asked the question of, do we have to have this much? Does there have to be 5 pages worth of information on this, or 10 pages or 15 pages on informed consent? And to a certain extent, the answer is yes, to make sure that there's a complete expression of what the patient may be considering. But also, we need to go back to, it needs to be in language that a layperson can understand. So if you decide you want to go the layman's route, if there's additional information that needs to be provided, perhaps a cover sheet with a layman's term, and then the detail behind it would be a good idea. Also, even in today's world, sometimes they don't get completed, which to me seems kind of improbable, but it does still occur. And then competing interests. Conflict of interest with issues with PIs is something that raises its head fairly often. These guys are academias. In most cases, they are in their investigations. They don't really understand in a lot of instances what that might be, what might be considered conflict of interest. So having your good conflict of interest protocol in place and having documentation they have signed off that they do not have any conflict of interest and that they understand what that means will protect everyone, including them, from any kind of litigation or issues that might arise. Very quickly, I'm going to talk about common billing errors, and then we'll move on. But the basis of these is the double billing. If you look at this list, for those of you that work in PFS, you understand that these things often are things that we deal with on every claim at some point in time. Double billing for services, that's critical thing in our edits. We don't want to be double billing for things that we do. Same instance here in clinical trials. Billing for services not rendered, absolutely. So we've got charge errors. Those are standard in the billing errors that occur. Billing for services that may be provided for free. This is kind of unique to this area. And then billing for services that are not covered, such as non-routine services or it's a non-qualifying trial. More of this, these things that you see on this list, they impact clinical trials just like they do your everyday business. Missing documentation, we don't have an order, we don't have an informed consent, we don't have medical necessity, issues related to poor coding practices, not collecting on your copays and deductibles, and billing without your proper codes or your modifiers or your identifier number. Another area that has created some focus is inducements, free services, focusing on indigents, or Medicare patients are told they don't have to pay. The OIG has said many of these trials study items for which there's already good treatments established. So we're going to be looking to see if they're in programs that could actually not be beneficial for new treatments, and there's better ways of taking care of our patients. We don't want to pay for clinical trials that are where there's more appropriate care that's available. Oddly enough, there's an MSP issue. Again, you work in this business every day, you understand MSP, but in clinical research, CMS has interpreted the agreement to pay for research related to injuries, which is really unique in these clinical trials, as triggering the MSP rule, and then prohibiting any kind of payment from Medicare. Other everyday risks that we all experience: false claims, anti-kickback, misconduct. The misconduct, I think, is a little bit more scary, but the other two, you live this world. So what do we do from a billing standpoint? Well, this slide depicts what every good patient accounting program needs to have. We need to have defined roles and responsibilities. We need to have good policies and implementation in place. We need to have training for our teams, and we need to audit these. But in this instance, what we see happening most often is that we see that there are silos with the clinical research program itself and everybody else in the organization. And often they're left to their own devices, and while they might be communicating with PFS to target or trigger those accounts that are clinical trials, PFS might not be well educated on what that means. They may allow claims to go through the people that are administering the protocols and are managing the charge entry. May not understand what's something that's dedicated to the trial and something that should be billed separately. So the best advice right here in this particular slide is to make sure you consider all the departments impacted. As you can see, this is pretty much the entire revenue cycle, from your legal contracting to your finance, patient financial services, documentation, your compliance department, your providers, and the review board. Consequences of non-compliance. Well, this doesn't change because this is clinical trials. It's all the same kind of consequences that we would suffer for any kind of non-compliance. Reputational risk, professional integrity compromise. We might actually injure it or create some adverse event for a patient. Additional oversight. There's just a host of things that happen. Shutdown of your projects, which in this instance would create that loss of funding. So as a recommendation in the whole for this, what you really want to look at is the organizational compliance culture. including your goals, leadership by senior managers, training and education, reinforcement of good behavior. Now, this is nothing that's dedicated to again, clinical trials. This is good practice for anybody that's billing to governmental entities, no matter if you're selling screws or you're taking care of patients. But in this instance, as I said, the silos that are often created between the clinical trials program and the remainder of the healthcare institution really can create some lack of structure, lack of leadership, and lack of engagement by those that think that everything is fine. And so our recommendation is they are a part of the global organization. They are included in organizational discussion. Their leadership reports up to the executive leadership of the organization, and that they have resources that are well educated in the administration of clinical trials, whether it be a dedicated CMO, your billing personnel, your finance department, a compliance colleague that understands the risk here, and that can make sure that any compliance concerns are bubbled up to your compliance committee and ultimately to the board. So I'm going to run through very quickly a couple of examples regarding particular instances in which the government has investigated. The most examples are either related to some kind of key term whistleblower, or they're actually self-disclosures. From a double billing standpoint, I'm not going to read these to you, but you can see that these two actually were self-reported, in which they identified that they had billed for cancer research services that were not routine costs, that they billed for trials that were also supposed to be billed for to the sponsor. I mean, these are all the same kind of instances. That's why I say the double billing is definitely a concern. And in most of these, I believe that they were actually self-disclosures. Then you look at anti-kickback. Medtronic in 2011 paid out a $2.23 million settlement for false claims of kickbacks to induce physicians to implant Medtronic pacemakers and defibrillators. Actually, I had an encounter with something that we never proved was this example, but we did learn through a compliance audit in which there had been discussions in the cardiac cath department about a certain physician who was implanting very expensive Medtronic pacemakers and defibrillators in very elderly patients. And through the course of conversation, the chief compliance officer said, "Oh yeah, I did hear that Dr. X had a relationship with Medtronic." False claims. This particular organization paid a $5 million settlement for importing unapproved devices and conducting trials. You talk about scathing, and which created all kinds of false claims, and it created others to submit false claims. And then grant funding. So in the National Institutions for Health, grant funding where has been a very heavy target, in which they've done settlements because of subjects being in these programs that did not actually get what they were supposed to do, submission of false data, charging for grant work not performed, giving out free stuff to people that didn't really were not really involved in the clinical trial. So at these several pages, I mean, we could go on and on and on about this, but the idea behind this is the very fact that this is being scrutinized. So from a compliance standpoint, it's extremely, extremely important that you understand the risk of each of these very specific areas. And also, we're going into the world even with where there's small businesses that are being identified, either through key TAM or just further investigation that have been involved in it. So it's really not safe for anyone at this point. And I'll give you two quick more examples, and then I think we'll pause for questions. And this one particularly, this is a huge Michigan hospital system just recently, in which they had a clinical trials program who was hired as a VP for this institute. And because of the culture of the organization, there was a group of very highly compensated physicians who controlled all the contracts and the grants. And essentially, according to the court documents, threatened this VP about making his life miserable if anyone stepped out of line of their control. Ultimately, the bad behavior cost the organization $84 million related to Stark and anti-kickback because of the perks and excess compensation for medical directorships and lease arrangements and office practices being supplying employees without charge. And ultimately, of course, they were engaged into signing or encouraged to sign a corporate integrity agreement, which they're now trying to administer. In this particular example, this is where a CEO is actually asked to voluntarily disclose about the submissions of false claims related to anti-kickback from a laboratory standpoint, and paid his very own settlement related to all the violations. So again, these are scary things to discuss, but they are real, and there is increased emphasis on the investigations and the pursuit of investigations by all those entities related to the proper administration and service surrounding clinical trials. You go back to the $4 billion mark, there's a lot of money that's being used to fund these things, and the government obviously wants to make sure that it's being done in an appropriate fashion. So with that, I will stop, and I will be glad to try to answer any questions that you might have. And if I don't know the answer, I'm sure that this team will help me get in touch with you to respond accordingly. Thank you.
All righty. Oops, I can't unmute myself. 1 second. Oh, there we go. Sorry about that, Denise. For some reason, I could not unmute my line, but I think we're good to go now. Before I take our first question, just wanted to remind everyone to type their questions into the questions chat panel located to the right of your screen, and we'll take as many as time will allow. We did get one question about accessing the slides, so you don't have to wait for that. If you missed the opening intro, you can download those slides right away by expanding the handouts panel located to the right of your screen and select that PDF icon. All right, so the first question that we have is, so how do you treat clinical trials that have already been underway since January 1st? So I guess if they're work in progress, how should they treat those?
So under the common rule, because there's so many little deadlines that they set out there, there was the proposed time period, there was the midsummer 2018, hey, it's for real, but we're not going to do it until January of 2019. What they have said is it's really kind of up to us to determine what's a limited type of clinical trial that would not require an annual evaluation, and what is not. So if you have a trial that's already been started, you have the opportunity now to take a look at that to see if it will qualify according to the definitions of limited. And we can get you those documents if you want to take a more detailed look in that. It is to take a look at them to see if they would qualify. You don't have to change anything for those trials that are already in place if you've got good things in practice, but it does give you the opportunity to reduce a little bit of workload if you believe that they could fall out into that limited or less qualifying trial definition.
All right, thank you for that. Our next question comes from Debbie. She says, we're having issues with Medicare Advantage plans paying after Medicare on our clinical trials. Are you, Denise, seeing others experience the same issue, perhaps any of your clients or others in the industry?
Great question, Debbie. Thank you. So I have to chuckle because when you say Medicare Advantage, I have to laugh anyway. And so, you know, the Medicare plans, Medicare Advantage plans, while they're supposed to administer and police based on the same type of guidance as Medicare has, often put up lots of roadblocks. And everyone that's in PFS understands that, and that's why this is no different. This is going to be one of those avenues that if Medicare is paid, then you're going to have to fight to determine if additional remittance can be provided. One of the things I'd probably suggest is look at the value of the collections, and sometimes because the stuff that you're billing to Medicare is not extremely expensive, it's more routine type stuff, it may not be worth the pursuit. But in any event, the answer to that question is these Medicare Advantage plans are really, really playing difficult in processing stuff that they should pay for as an automatic.
Thank you so much for that, Denise. It looks like those are the only two questions that have come through. So last call for any questions as I just share some last minute notes. First, well, actually, we already have our next one scheduled. So we will have these monthly. Please feel free to visit HFMA's website at hfma-co.org to check out some other in-person and online events that they have scheduled. So if there aren't any other questions, I'll use this time to thank our members and the healthcare community for joining the call. As you exit, you'll be prompted to complete a survey, and we would really appreciate you sharing your feedback about today's events, as well as letting us know other topics that you'd like to see in future webinars. Denise, it was such a pleasure. We're so grateful that you took the time to not only deliver the presentation, but the time that it took for you to prepare this information-rich presentation. Any final thoughts or anything that you'd like to share as we wrap up today's call?
I don't think so. At the end of the presentation, though, you'll find my contact information as well as our firm's information. So at any point in time you have questions, please feel free to email or reach out to me, and we will be glad to help you navigate through this complex matter.
It is definitely complex indeed. Thank you so much, Denise, again, for taking your time. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. And we hope to see you online in the near future. Have a great afternoon, everyone.